So what I'd like to do today is tell you a little bit about the fundamentals of this field and some of the sort of famous results in the area. And I'd also like to do a couple of experiments, demonstrations. And then, if there's time, at the end, I'd like to tell you a little bit about some work that we've been doing on this here at the University of Michigan. So let's start at the beginning with what is a network. So that word means lots of different things to different people. But to me, for the purposes of this lecture, a network is just a bunch of dots joined together by lines in some way. In the jargon of the field, a dot is called a node or a vertex, plural vertices, one vertex, two vertices. And a line is called an edge. So nodes and edges. I will use that jargon in this talk. So nodes and edges. Why are we interested in these things? Well, we're interested in them because they can be used to represent the structure of all sorts of things that we're interested in the real world. Here's an example. This is a picture of the internet. So the internet is a network of computers connected together so that you can send data from one computer to another. So the nodes in this network are computers, and the edges, the connections that connect them together, are data connections of some kind, usually cables running through the ground, like optical fiber and so forth. So you look at a picture like this, you can already tell there's something interesting going on here. Look at this network. It's clear that it's not completely regular, like it's not a square grid or something like that, but it's also not completely random. There's some structure in there. There's these stars and these wheel-like structures, and there's all this sort of filamentary stuff going on in the background. There's something going on there. And one can well imagine that the structure of this network could have a lot to say about how the internet works. Right? The internet is there for a reason, right? It does a job. It gets data from one place to another place. And you can certainly imagine that the structure of the network is going to affect how good it is at getting data from A to B. So we look at a network like this and we say, well, first of all, what's the structure of this network? How can we characterize this thing? And then once we understand what its structure is, how is that going to affect the way the internet performs? Could we make some changes to the network to make it work better? Are there weak points or bottlenecks in the network that we can identify? Can we find places where if I built an extra spur or an extra connection here, I would make the thing work better? Those are the kinds of questions that we can answer. So those are the sort of things we do in this field. We try and understand what the shape of the networks is and how they affect the behavior of the systems they describe. So let me give you a few other examples of networks that people study. So the internet is a technological network. Here's another example of a technological network. This is one that many of us are familiar with if you've ever been on an airplane. So this is an airline network. The nodes in this network are airports, and the edges are scheduled flights from one airport to another airport. So just like the internet, its job is to get data around the internet. This network, its job is to get passengers around the country. So again, you can imagine that the structure of this network affects how good it is at doing its job of getting people from A to B. Those are technological networks. Another important class of networks that we study, a little bit more abstract, is information networks. An information network is a network which represents the structure of some body of information. And the classic example is the World Wide Web. So if you go out on the web and you look at a web page like this one, there'll be things on that web page that you can click on. And if you click on them, it takes you to some other web page. Right? So there's a connection between this web page and that web page, in that if you click on this one, you get to that one. Now, a hyperlink in the web jargon. So the web is a network where the nodes are web pages and the edges are hyperlinks between web pages. You can click on this one to get to that one. In the common parlance, internet and web are pretty much interchangeable terms. We don't really distinguish between those. We say, I found this thing on the web, or I found this thing on the internet. Same difference. But really, they're quite different networks. The internet is a physical network of cables running through the ground. Its nodes are computers. The web is a software network where the nodes are web pages, and the connections between them are hyperlinks. You can click on this web page to get to that one. The World Wide Web is one of the biggest networks ever studied. It has billions of nodes, at least. Here's a picture of just a portion of it. So it's a very big, dense, complicated network with many nodes. We certainly can't picture the whole thing. It's far too big. So that's an information network. Another important class of network, one that's caused a lot of excitement recently, is biological networks. So biologists are very interested in networks recently. Biologists have a lot of kinds of data that can be represented as a network structure of some kind. And they're very hopeful that the ideas of network science will be applicable to those kinds of data, help us understand the data that's coming out of biological labs. Here's just one example. This is an ecological network. So in this network, the nodes represent species in an ecosystem, and the edges represent which species eats which other species. So this is a predator-prey network. Who eats whom for dinner? In the common parlance, we talk about the food chain. You know, we say the lion is at the top of the food chain, and this other species is dangling at the bottom of the food chain. But that's kind of misleading. It gives you the idea that it's just like this chain of species. This one eats this one, eats this one, eats this one. But that's not what it's like at all. Actually, it's this incredibly complicated food web of interactions between different species. It's not just a single chain at all. This network actually introduces one other thing that we haven't seen before in the earlier examples. If you look there, that node there has this little earring hanging off the side of it. That's called a self-edge in network speak. It's an edge that connects a node to itself. That little earring is the graph theoretical representation of cannibalism, right? That's a species that eats itself, right? So this particular network here is actually a real ecosystem. This is an ecosystem of freshwater species living in a lake in Wisconsin called Little Rock Lake. So it's a particular place. Some ecologists went there. They found all the species in this lake, and they worked out which ones eat which other ones, and they built this picture. And some of the species eat themselves. So there's a few of these earrings scattered around here. That particular node, the one at the top of the food chain, is the small-mouthed bass. It's a fish. It's about this big. And the earring in these cases usually means a species that either eats its young or eats its dead. Here's another biological network example, a little bit more abstract. This one is a picture of a metabolic network. The nodes in this network are metabolites, i.e. chemicals in the cell, like the cells in your body. And the edges connect them together are metabolic reactions. They're the chemical reactions that change one metabolite into another metabolite in the cell. So this is a network representation of the chemistry of the cell, all the many thousands of different reactions that are going on in your cell. And the hope is that by studying networks like this, we can start to make sense of this very complicated chemical machinery that runs your body. So we did technological networks, and we did information networks, and we did biological networks. One further class of networks I want to talk about, which is one that I do a lot of my own work on, is social networks. So social networks, if you say the word social network to a lot of people, what they think of is, you know, Facebook these days, or LinkedIn, or whatever. But to a scientist, a social network doesn't just mean Facebook. It doesn't just refer to online social networks. It refers to any network that connects people together. It's any network where the nodes are people and the edges are some kind of social connections between people. Here is an example. People have been studying this for a long time. So here is a very old example from the 1930s. This guy here, Jacob Moreno, often credited with being the first person to study social networks scientifically. He was a psychiatrist working in New York City, and he was interested in patterns of interaction amongst groups of people. And he started making these little pictures, like this one here. This comes from a book that he published in 1934. And this one here shows patterns of play amongst children in an elementary school schoolyard. So the nodes here represent the kids in the schoolyard, and the edges represent which kids played with which other kids. So you look at a picture like this, and you can immediately see there's something going on here. right? You can see that there are these two groups. There's the triangles on the left and the circles on the right, and triangles are playing with other triangles, and circles are playing with other circles, and they're not playing with each other. So if you had to guess what the two groups are, what would it be? Boys and girls, right? This is an elementary school. The boys play with the other boys, and the girls play with other girls, and the boys and the girls are not playing with each other, except for this one pair here. Right? So you can look at something like this, and you can immediately see what's going on here, and this very quickly convinced people that this was a useful way of representing patterns of interaction. The fact that it just sort of jumps out at you once you look at the network. And people have pretty much been doing this kind of thing ever since. Here's a few other examples. Here's a picture that comes from my friend Jim Moody, who's at Duke University, and it's from a study he did. It's basically the modern equivalent of the same thing. So this is a US high school, in fact, from the 1990s. The nodes represent the kids in the school, and the edges represent who's friends with whom. There's a bunch of interesting things going on in this network, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later. But let me just point out one thing. There are arrows on the edges of this network. They point one particular way. Right? This is what we call a directed network. I don't know if you can all see that. The arrows are pretty small. Maybe you can't see it in the back. But all of these edges have little arrowheads on them pointing which way, showing which way they point. So what's going on there? You know, it's supposed to be a friendship network, right? You think of friendship as being a two-way street. What's with this one-way thing? Well, it's to do with how you work out who's friends with whom. How do you actually know in a school who's friends with whom? Well, you just go ask them. You know, you do a survey, you do interviews, you circulate a questionnaire, whatever you say. Who are you friends with? Right? So what you get is person A says they're friends with person B, but then some of the time person B doesn't also say that they're friends with person A. Okay? So that's a little bit weird. What's going on there? Well, you know, that's human nature. Sure, this is going to happen. About 50% of the time, actually, that's what happens. But it raises some interesting questions, like how are we actually going to interpret these data? Are these people friends or are they not friends? So it's not just a totally clean problem in this particular case. I'll talk a little bit more about this later. Here's another example. This came from Valdez Krebs. It's from a study he worked on of the spread of tuberculosis. So one of the reasons that scientists are interested in social networks, I mean, apart from the fact that they're fun, is because they affect the spread of disease. Right? How do diseases spread? Well, if I have the flu, in order to give you the flu, we have to be sort of quite close together. In other words, there's some network of the people that you have contact with, and those are the people that you could spread a disease to. So if you want to understand how diseases spread, you need to know what the structure of that network is. So there's this very close connection between the structure of social networks and the way diseases spread. And people have put a lot of effort into studying networks just for that reason. So this is from a study of the spread of tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is an airborne disease. So to spread it, you have to cough on somebody or sneeze on them or something like that. So you have to be pretty close together. You have to be physically close together in order to spread this disease. So then this would be a network of who's been physically close to who's been in close proximity to who else. And this is the network that TB spreads over. Here's another example from Jim Moody, again from the same study. It's called the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health, big study that he masterminded in the 90s. So this is another example from a high school. So again, the nodes in this picture represent students in a high school, a US high school. They are color-coded blue and pink in this picture. There's traditional baby gift color code to represent the boys and the girls. And the edges in this network represent who dated whom during their high school career. Yeah, Check out this guy here. Yeah, So yeah, this is a fun network. I'm sure plenty of us would like to see a network like this for our high school. But there's also a serious side to it, again. Right? This comes from a big multi-million-dollar study. Why did they put money into this? They put money into this because they are interested, they're concerned about the spread of HIV and other sexually transmitted diseases. And if that's what you want to know about, then this is the network that you need to be looking at. So again, a lot of serious scientific attention has gone into studying these things. Here's an example from my own work. This is a network of collaborations between scientists. When scientists work together, they write scientific papers. And so you can tell who's worked together by going and looking who published scientific papers. Oh, Watson and Crick published a scientific paper together. They must have worked together. These days, we have great databases of published scientific papers, electronic databases online. So what I did is I just got hold of an entire copy of one of these databases and built the entire network of all the scientists who have written papers with other scientists. So in this way, you can get a very complete picture of who's collaborated with whom, and you don't ever need to go and do those surveys or questionnaires or interviews, right, which are very laborious. This is a much quicker way of getting data. So we've got some very large social networks this way, millions of people. One last example. I was kind of rude about online social networks, Facebook and so forth, but they are actually an interesting new source of social network data that we didn't have until a few years ago. Right? Companies like Facebook have a lot of data on who's connected to whom and who's friends with whom. Indeed, Facebook has an entire research division that does scientific research on Facebook's own data. One of my former graduate students went to work for Facebook a couple of years ago, taking his ideas about social networks and going to apply them to Facebook data. OK, so there's a few examples of the kind of networks we look at. I want to tell you now about some of the sort of scientific results that people have discovered from looking at these networks. I want to start off by talking about what is perhaps the most famous of all results in the social networks literature. One that you've probably heard of is called the small world effect, or sometimes called the 6 degrees of separation. It goes back to a very famous experiment conducted by this guy here. His name's Stanley Milgram. He was an experimental psychologist. He was then a professor at Harvard University. And he was interested in what's the sort of the path, the chain that links two people together in the social network. You know, I know a guy who knows a guy who knows a guy, that kind of thing. How far am I going to have to go before I get from me to you? That was the question he was interested in. He asked some of his friends, his colleagues at Harvard, so how long do you think it is, typically, the chain that links two people together? And they were like, oh, I don't know, 100 steps, 1,000, 1,000,000. They were completely wrong. As you probably know, turns out to be much shorter than that. He did this experiment to prove it. The way he did the experiment was he sent letters to participants, essentially randomly chosen people. And the game was, you have to get this letter to a target person that he chose. It was a friend of his who was a stockbroker in Boston, Massachusetts. But you're not allowed to send the letter just straight to the target person. Okay? You can only give the letter to somebody that you know on a first-name basis. That was the rule. So you think, who do I know on a first-name basis who's closer, in some sense, to this target person? You give the letter to them, and then they repeat the exercise. They give it to somebody they know on a first-name basis, and so on. So you're passing it hand to hand until, hopefully, you get it to this target person. That's the game. Doesn't have to be somebody who's closer in a geographic sense, right? I could say, oh, I know somebody else who lives in the state of Massachusetts. I'll give the letter to them. But it could be somebody who's closer to them in a social sense. Oh, I know somebody who works in the banking industry or something. So maybe they would be closer to this stockbroker than I am. I'll give it to them. So whatever. You can make your own choice about who you give it to. But the goal is to do this sort of cooperative exercise where you pass the letter hand to hand until it gets to this target person. So about 300 people were asked to do this exercise. Letters could only be passed to first-name acquaintances. First, most obvious result that comes out of this is that most of the letters got lost. Right? Of course they did. Right? You get this letter in the mail, and you're like, what is this thing? And it goes in the trash, and you never think about it again. Right? So only about a quarter of the letters actually got to their intended target. But of the ones that got there, the discovery was that it took about 6 steps to get from, randomly chosen person in Nebraska to this target stockbroker in Boston. So this is the origin of this result, this sort of mythical result. The 6 degrees of separation, there's only 6 steps between anybody and anybody else in the world. I don't know if it's 6. It could be 4. It could be 8 or something. But it's not a million. Okay, that's the result here. It's some small number of steps. So this is often referred to as the 6 degrees of separation, which is actually not Milgram's phrase. It came from the title of this play, later made into a pretty good movie, actually, that you might possibly have seen. It's also become part of the culture. There's this game you may have heard of, the 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, where you try and connect movie actors together by what movies they've been in, and it's alleged that you can connect any movie actor to Kevin Bacon in 6 steps or less. It's also the subject of satirical headlines in the Onion newspaper. People do the same thing with mathematicians. Apparently Paul Erdős is the Kevin Bacon of the mathematician world. They do it with billionaires. So there's a lot of this stuff. You can do it with yourself as well. For example, I can ask, what's the shortest path from me to the President of the United States? Well, it turns out that I went to college with a woman named Karen Ruff, whose father, Chuck Ruff, was a lawyer in Washington, D.C. I met him a few times. There he is. He was best known for being Bill Clinton's lawyer during his impeachment trial in the 90s, and Bill Clinton knows Barack Obama. So there you go, 3 steps, and we got from me to the President of the United States. But now, you guys all know me, right? So that means that it's only 4 steps from you to the President of the United States, right? You see how this works, right? Well, technically, 4 is an upper bound. It could be less than 4, but 4 is the most it is. Right? So we're going to do a little experiment now to demonstrate this. You might say, where is my experimental apparatus? You are going to be the experiment. Okay? We're going to do an experiment with the audience in this room to demonstrate this small world effect. And to start off the experiment, we're going to make a chain. And to start off the chain, I'd like a volunteer. Who would like to be the first person in the chain? Yes, sir. What is your name?
Jed.
Jed?
Yes.
Pleased to meet you, Jed. I'm Mark. You can stay there. You can just stand there. Okay. Very good. So what we're going to do is we're going to start. So this is Jed. Take a look at Jed. If you know Jed, I'd like you to stand up now. Very good. These are the people who are 1 degree of separation away from Jed. Okay. Now look at the people who just stood up. If you know one of the people who just stood up, could you also stand up? Uh-oh. Uh-oh. All right, you can sit down again. We're going to start another chain. All right, thank you. Another volunteer from another part of the audience. Yes. What is your name?
Henry.
Henry. Pleased to meet you, Henry. Okay. If you know Henry, please also stand up now. Okay. Oh, okay. Very good. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are the people who are 1 step away from Henry. Excellent. Now, if you know one of the people who just stood up, please also stand up now. Oh, very good. Okay. Now, if you know, these are the people who are 2 degrees of separation away from Henry. Now, if you know one of those people who just stood up, I want you also to stand up. Okay, we're doing pretty good here. We're doing pretty good here. That's 3 degrees of separation. I'd say we got about half the people in the room, a bit more. Okay, let's do 1 more round. If you know one of those people who just stood up, it's your turn to stand up now. Very good. I'd say we got like 90% of people. Should we do 1 more round? Okay, 1 more round. If you know somebody who just stood up on that round, it's also your turn to stand up now. Very good. I think we got most of the people in the room. It's interesting, there's like a subset of people over here who never stood up. That's interesting. Maybe, yeah, maybe we have a separate component of the network over there. Okay, so we did 4 degrees of separation there. Thank you very much. We did 4 degrees of separation, and we got from Henry to 90% of the people in the room. So you can see the way this works. You choose a first person, and then they know a few people, and they know a still bigger number of people, and they know a still bigger number of people. It just grows faster and faster as you go out. You can do a little bit of math to explain this to yourself. Suppose everybody knows 100 people. Then I have 100 people who are 1 degree separation away from me, my 100 friends. Right? Each of them knows 100 people. So the number of people 2 steps away from me is 100 times 100, or 10,000. The number of people 3 steps away is 100 times 100 times 100, which is 1,000,000. And then it's 100 million, and then it's 10 billion. But 10 billion is more than the population of the whole world. There's only 7 billion people in the world, so that's it. I got everybody, and I can stop now. I only had to go 5 steps, right? Excellent question. Somebody asked a good question over there. So excellent question. So yeah, there is a problem with this argument, which is that, sure, sorry? So the question was, aren't some of them the same people? Aren't you overcounting? So it could well be true that my friends have 100 friends each. I have 100 friends each. My friends has 100 friends. But a lot of their friends are also my friends, right? So I already counted them. I don't get to count them again. So it's not really 100 times 100. So that's actually an excellent question. And that was one of the first questions that the mathematicians addressed when they looked at this field. It's like, that's clearly a problem. How can this work out? So you're absolutely right, and there's actually some extra math you have to do there to convince yourself that this kind of argument really does work for real networks. So it's not quite as simple as I've made it out here. All right, very good. So this can have real practical consequences. So what you're saying, so what this calculation actually is, in mathematical terms, is this is exponential growth, so-called. If you're multiplying by a number each time, then we call that exponential growth. So like 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, or 100 times 100 times 100. That's exponential growth. It's very rapid growth. It only takes you 5 steps to get to the population of the entire world. Right? Here is an application of this to the spread of disease. So I mentioned that the spread of disease is one of the scientific applications of social networks. So what we're looking at here is data on the outbreak of a disease called the Spanish flu, which was an often fatal form of viral pneumonia that, an influenza that was pandemic in 1918-1919, killed about 100 million people. And the data that we're looking at here is data on the outbreak that they had in the city of San Francisco, California. So horizontal axis in this graph is time from the start of the outbreak, and vertical axis is how many people were reported as having been infected with the Spanish flu. And you see it's going up like this. This particular plot has a logarithmic vertical scale and a linear horizontal scale. You don't really need to know what that means in detail, but in practice, that straight line growth there tells you that it's growing exponentially. If you plot a graph on this logarithmic and linear scale, you get a straight line like that, it tells you it's growing exponentially. Now, it doesn't go on growing exponentially forever. After a while, it levels off. Why is that? It's just because it ran out of people to infect, right? Everybody who's going to get the disease had got it, and there wasn't anybody left to get it. So it levels off after a while. But initially, for like the first month or so, it's growing as a straight line on this plot, which means it's exponential. And that's precisely because of this small world effect. It's precisely because the first person to get the disease spreads it to 10 others, and they spread it to 10 others, and they spread it to 10 others, and is growing exponentially as it goes out from the starting person. So what this means, in effect, is that it's only going to take a small number of steps for the disease to get from wherever it starts to anybody else. So the small world effect has an important implication. If it's really only 6 steps from anybody to anybody else, then you're not very far from the first person who gets this disease. It's not going to take very long to reach you. If it was 1,000,000 steps, it would take a lot longer to reach you, and you'd be a lot safer. So it's kind of bad news in that way. Lest you should think, however, that this result is kind of obvious, let me also give you a counterexample to show you that it doesn't always work like that. This is a plot from actually one of my own papers that just came out recently. And what it shows is the spread of the Black Death in 14th century Europe. So Black Death was an outbreak of plague that happened in Europe in the 1340s. Actually, it started sort of somewhere over there in Northern Asia. It spread south into China, then along the Silk Road to Constantinople. Then it spread along the Mediterranean in trade ships, and starting in 1347, it moved northwards across the European continent. And what this map is showing is the contours of where it had got to at roughly 6-month intervals during that outbreak. Well, right there you can see that this is not exponential growth. Right? I'm not going to claim that there's like exactly equal numbers of people between each of these contours or something like that. But it's clearly not growing exponentially, right? It's clearly not going up by a factor of 100 or something every 6 months. It's clearly just sort of marching across the landscape, infecting sort of roughly even numbers of people every 6 months. It's not growing exponentially. So what this tells you is you didn't have the small world effect back in the 14th century. We do now. You can tell that by the way diseases spread, or by Milgram's experiment. But back then, at least looking at the way this disease spread, it looks like there was no small world effect. So the small world effect is not a given thing. It's not something that happens automatically. Apparently, it didn't exist a few hundred years ago. It's a modern phenomenon. Probably for most of mankind's tenure on Earth, there was no small world effect. This is quite a new thing. OK, very good. So that's one interesting thing, the small world effect. Here's another one. So how many people does a person know? It's an interesting question. If I asked you, how many people do you know? You probably can't answer it. Most people are not very good at answering that question. Oh, I don't know, 100, 1,000, I don't know. How many people do you know? In fact, people aren't even good at, even if you just ask them to write down the names of everybody they know, they're not good at that either. People are just not very good at bringing to mind the names of everybody they know. So in order to get at this question, Russ Bernard and Peter Kilworth suggested a cool strategy. And the way their strategy works is they present people with a list of names. These are the 48 most common names in the United States according to the US Census. And they say, how many people do you know with names on this list? These names on this list account for about, I don't know, something like 1% of the population of the United States. So if I know how many people you know with names on this list, then the total number of people you know is something like 100 times the number you know on this list. This is 1% of the population, then multiply by 100. So it doesn't give you an exact number for how many people you know, but it gives you an estimate. So I'd like to do this experiment now with the audience in this room. Okay? I won't tell you what the result is going to be, but we'll see. It's always the same thing. It's kind of interesting. So what I want you to do, we'll take like a minute or two, and I want you to go through this list one by one and count how many people you know with names on this list. Their surname should be on this list. And here's the rules. First of all, what does know mean? Know is going to mean, you know this person well. If you pass them on the street, you'd know their name, you'd greet them, you'd say hello, right? This is somebody that you're on a friendly basis with, okay? And also, very important, if you know two people with the same name, if you know two people called Adams, then you count twice, right? So you're counting people, not names, okay? So if you know 10 people called Adams, then you count 10, okay? Any questions? Okay, we're going to do the start counting. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do it. I'm going to do it as well. Okay, go. Okay, very good. So we're going to take a poll now. How many people knew between 0 and 5 people on the list? A few people? Okay, a few hands. How many people knew between 5 and 10? Okay, now we got quite a lot. I'd say there's like 30 people there. How many people knew between 10 and 15? Okay, 15 to 20. Okay, it's falling off a bit now. Between 20 and 30, say. Decent number, but that's a bigger interval, 20 to 30. 30 to 40. Oh, that was me as well, actually, by the way. 30 to 40? Okay, it's getting a bit thin now. I guess we got about 6 to 7 people there. 40 to 50. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. 50 to 60. 1, 2. 2. Above 60. 1, 2. How many?
I didn't make it past about Parker.
Okay. 80. Okay. Close to 200. Okay, very good. Excellent. So if I was going to draw a graph of this, excellent. Thank you. If I was going to draw a graph of this, it's going to be something like the first bin was a moderate number, then there were a lot of people in the second bin, and there were a lot of people in the third bin. Then it started to fall off a bit, and they made the bins a bit bigger, but it was something like this, and then it was something like this, something like this, and then there was one person here at 80 and one person out here at 200. So that's roughly the sort of thing. I've got something that looks like this. This is what my graph would look like, right? This is what the graph always looks like, right? You do this experiment, doesn't matter who you do it with, it always looks like this. There's lots of people who know a small number of people. This is me down here. And then there's a few people out here, we call them the hubs in the network, that have lots of connections. This is always the way it turns out, right? So this is a sort of well-known result. Take a picture like this. There's actually a picture of the internet, but it doesn't matter what network you look at. It's always true. There's a few hubs in the network. You can see them in this picture, right? There's a hub, there's a hub, there's a hub, right? There's a few nodes that have lots of connections, and then there's all of these other nodes, lots of them scattered around that just have a few connections. This is always the way it looks. So this is a very frequent pattern that we often see. Oh, incidentally, this was first studied by this chap here. His name's Anatole Rappaport. He was a professor here at the University of Michigan until the 1970s. So a very influential guy, did some important early experiments on friendship networks amongst school students in the Ann Arbor School District. So here's what it looks like if you sort of really do this graph. So the graph here is sort of horizontal axis is how many people I know. Vertical axis is how many people were in that bin. How many people know that many people. And it doesn't matter what network you look at. It's always this right skewed thing. It's always this plot that goes down to the right like that. So you're looking at horizontal axis, how many people do I know? Vertical axis, how many people have that many friends? Large number of people with just a few friends. Small number of people with lots of friends there. So there's always just a few people in the network that have a really large number of connections. Or it doesn't have to be a social network. It can be the power grid or the internet or something like that. But it's the same picture. Lots of nodes have just a few connections. A few nodes have lots of connections. So it always ends up looking something like this, that there are a few big hubs in the network. So this can have important implications as well. Here's a picture that I showed earlier. This was the picture that came from Valdez Krebs' study of the spread of tuberculosis. So imagine what effect this has on the spread of a disease, right? There are some hubs in this network. They're pretty obvious, like this node here right in the middle. There are some nodes that really have a lot of connections. And if that person gets sick, then they can give the disease potentially to a lot of people. So it turns out that these hubs are very important for the spread of disease in the network. In fact, they're even more important than you might initially think. If one had to think, what's important about a node that makes it spread the disease, well, you'd say it's the number of connections it has. It's what we call the degree in the jargon. The degree of a node is how many connections it has. So you'd say, has twice the degree, twice as good at spreading the disease. 10 times the degree, 10 times as good at spreading the disease. Well, that's kind of the right idea, but it turns out to be not exactly the right idea. So the actual answer is that it's not your degree that matters, but the square of your degree. So I can give you the hand-wavy explanation for why that is. So suppose this person here got sick. That would be really bad. They could spread the disease to a lot of people. This person has what? Maybe 100 connections or something like that. So they're 100 times more effective at spreading the disease than somebody who only has one connection. But here's the thing. They're also 100 times more likely to get the disease in the first place. Right? Because they got 100 people they can catch it from. They could catch it from any of those people and then give it to 100 people. So they're 100 times more likely to get infected and 100 times more likely to pass it on. So they're 100 times 100, 10,000 times as effective at spreading the disease as somebody who only has one connection. Somebody who has 1,000 connections is 1,000,000 times more effective at spreading the disease. So this really matters a lot. In fact, it turns out that in many things, the hubs in the network are pretty much all that matters. If you understand those, then you don't need the other 99% of the network. The behavior of the system is dominated by just the few people who have a lot of connections. I saw there was somebody with a hand up over here.
So is it just the hubs and the number of connections? Where does it factor in the strength of the connection?
Oh, excellent question. So the question was, is it just the number of connections or does the strength matter as well? And yes, absolutely the strength does. So I'm sort of glossing over that. But if I was looking at something like this, a network for who's been in contact with whom, then you might be in contact with some people for longer, which give you a better chance of spreading the disease to those people. So absolutely. And technically, what I should really be looking at here is not just the number of connections, but I should be sort of adding up the strength of all those connections. If I'm in contact with that person for twice as long as this person, then that's a sort of a 2 plus a 1 or a 3. It's like being in contact with 3 different people for 1 unit of time, except one of them was 2 and one of them was 1. So I should really be sort of adding up the strengths of the connections, yeah. So good question, and I've kind of glossed over that a bit here. Any other questions? All right, very good. So here's a practical example of that. from the spread of an actual disease. This is real data from the spread of a disease called severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS. It's a viral disease that was, there was a bad outbreak of it in Southeast Asia in 2002, 2003. This is data that comes from the outbreak they had in Singapore. This picture was put together by my colleague Steve Borgatti, and so this shows all the people they know about that got the infection. Here's the first case that they know about that got the infection, patient 1 over here. And unfortunately, patient 1 is a hub, right? Patient 1 spread the disease to all of these people here. They're a hub. Of course, almost all of the people that they spread it to are not hubs, because 99% of the people in the network are not hubs. Right? So most of the people that patient 1 spread it to here, they didn't pass it on to anybody else. So maybe they passed it on to one other person, and then that's it. So the disease would have died out right there, except that one of the people that 1 passed it on to is number 6 over here, who's another hub. Gives the disease another big boost, pass it on to lots of people. Most of those people they pass it on to, it only goes on to 1 or 2 other people, and then it dies out, except for number 35 here, another hub, gives it another big boost, and so on. So you can see that these hubs in the network are just sort of single-handedly keeping the disease alive. If the hubs weren't there, the disease would just die out. But because of this small fraction of hubs in the network, they're responsible for keeping the disease alive. This makes you think, maybe I could eradicate the disease, prevent it from spreading, if I could just find the hubs. You know, I don't need to vaccinate everybody in the community or something like that. If I could just find that 1% of people who's responsible for spreading the disease and give them a vaccine, then that would be enough to prevent the disease from spreading, which is a very good idea and certainly something that people have thought about. The catch is, it's hard to know who the hubs are. How do you find that? We don't have a picture of the social network of the whole world where we can just look up who the hubs are. But certainly a reasonable suggestion. OK, very good. So now, in the remaining time, I've got about 10 minutes left, I wanted to talk about some work that we've been doing here at Michigan. And one of the things that we've been looking at is so-called assortative mixing. So here is a picture. This is another of Jim Moody's data. So this picture is from one of our papers, but it's his data on friendship networks amongst students in high school. So the nodes are the students, and the edges are who's friends with whom. And you'll notice that there's 2 big groups of students in this particular network, the group on the left and the group on the right. Anybody want to guess what those 2 groups are?
Jocks and academics.
Jocks and the nerds? Somebody said it, yeah. In fact, it's race in this case. So the white nodes are the white kids, and the black nodes are the black kids. So this is a school which is quite strongly divided along racial lines. This is not news to sociologists. They've been studying this for a long time. It's something they call assortative mixing or homophily. It's the observation that people tend to associate with other people who are like them in some way. Right? So it could be all sorts of things. It could be pretty much, actually, you name it. People will associate along those lines. It doesn't have to be race. It could be age, income, nationality, what language you speak, what your educational level is. Pretty much, you name it, people prefer to associate with other people who are like them. Right? You can occasionally also have dis-assortative mixing, where people prefer to associate with people who are unlike them. An obvious example would be who you date, right? The boys tend to date the girls, and vice versa. But this assortative mixing, homophily, is something that we see very often in social networks. So here's a couple of other examples. This is, again, from one of these studies of a high school. This is assortative mixing by age. So in this plot, each dot represents a friendship between 2 of the students in the school. Horizontal axis is the grade of one of the students. Vertical axis is the grade of the other student. So this dot here represents a friendship between a 9th grade student and an 11th grade student. Okay? And what you see is there's a lot of dots down the diagonal here in the middle of the plot, and fewer dots off the diagonal, meaning that most friendships are amongst students of about the same age. Okay? So that's a assortative mixing or homophily by age. People tend to be friends with other people about the same age as them. Here's another example. This is from something called the National Survey of Family Growth, which was conducted here at the University of Michigan. So it's a survey of couples. And what it shows, horizontal axis, so it's These are married couples. Horizontal axis is the age of the husband. Vertical axis is the age of the wife at the time they got married. And again, what you see is there's sort of a band here along the diagonal indicating that most people tend to be married to somebody who's about the same age as them. Now, I'm not claiming that marriage is a network. I assume that everybody's only married to one person at a time. So it doesn't really form a network, but I'm sort of thinking of this as a proxy for friendships. Right? Presumably people are friends before they get married. So the fact that they're getting married to people the same age as them indicates maybe that they're also friends with people who are the same age as them. So there's some network there of who's friends or who's dating or something, and it seems to have homophily by age. So you can use this, for instance, to predict things. If you go look at networks, you find about 70% of your friends vote the same way as you do. So if I just took your friends, took a majority vote of them, I could predict very accurately how you're going to vote as well. 79% of people within 5 years of their spouse's age. So that's the plot that we just saw. In that high school study that I showed, 67% of friends were in the same grade. So in other words, within a year of each other. And 83% of friends had the same ethnicity. There was another study done of couples, dating couples in San Francisco, California. 72% of people in that study were of the same ethnicity as their partner. Or here's a non-social network example from the World Wide Web. If you look at weblogs, blogs about politics, you find that almost all of the links between blogs are between blogs that have the same political persuasion. Between liberal blogs and other liberal blogs, or conservative blogs and other conservative blogs. Very few links from a liberal blog to a conservative blog, or vice versa. And so how would one actually go about quantifying this homophily effect? Well, I could just tell you the numbers I just told you, sort of what fraction are between people who are sort of in the same group, right? But that's not really getting at what I want to do. Why not? Well, because some fraction of connections would be between people in the same group, whatever I did. Take the high school example. Take what fraction of connections are between people in the same grade? Well, there are 4 grades in high school, and they're about the same sizes. So about a quarter of the students in the school are in each grade. So now if I just picked my friends at random, regardless of what grade they are, there's a 1 in 4 chance that I'm going to pick somebody who's in the same grade as me, right? Because a quarter of them are. So 25%, that's how much friends I would expect to have in the same grade as me, even if I just were picking my friends at random, ignoring who they are, right? So really what I want to know is, how many more friends do I have in the same grade as me than that, right? 25% is nothing. That's just what I would expect anyway. So I calculate something called a modularity. I expect to have 25% of my friends in the same grade. If I just chose all of my friends from the whole school, then I'd have 1 quarter, 1 quarter, 1 quarter in each of the 4 grades. 25% of them would be in the same grade as me. But what I actually observed was that it was 67%. So I calculated a number I call the modularity, which is 60%, 70% minus 25%, 42%. That's sort of how much more friends I have in my grade than I would expect if I just made my friends at random. Right? So this is the number, we call this modularity. It's the number we use to characterize how much of this homophily there is in a network. We can do it with other things. For example, we talked about how many people are within 5 years of their spouse's age. Well, it turns out that if people just chose their spouse at random, about 66% of them would be within 5 years of their spouse's age. Why is that? That might sound a bit odd to you. I mean, surely a lot of the population is not within 5 years of your age. Yes. But the thing is, most people get married around the same time in life, sort of in their 20s, typically. So people are not getting married younger than that, because they can't legally get married younger than that. And people are not getting married older than that because they're already married to somebody, right? So most of the people who can actually get married are around that age. So when you're choosing, if you were choosing a spouse at random, well, you'd have to choose them at random from the people who are actually eligible to marry you. Right? You can't marry somebody who's already married to somebody else, for instance. So if you're doing that, then it turns out that 66% of the time, even if you just chose randomly, you would choose a spouse who's within 5 years of your age. So now it doesn't look so impressive that 79% of people are within 5 years of their spouse's age, because we kind of expect a lot of that anyway, just from random chance. If I take 79 and minus 66, I get 13%. Pretty small number. So the modularity is small. It's telling you that actually there's not much going on here. It's not such a big surprise that I got that percentage of people within 5 years of their spouse's age. On the other hand, if I look at that study of dating couples in California, the equivalent figure for how many people would be in the same ethnic group as the person they're dating would be 29% if they chose at random. So the modularity is 72%, what we saw, minus 29% of 43%. So again, a pretty big number, or even bigger than this one we saw up here. Okay. Okay. So this is how we measure this modularity that's going on in the network. So everybody get the idea here? This is going to come back again in a moment. Okay, so here's a thing that we've been working on. We're interested in modular structure in networks. A lot of the networks we look at have this kind of structure. There's like a group of friends here and a group of friends there and a group of friends there, but there are not many connections between the groups. Okay? This is something we see in many networks, and we're interested to pick this out of the networks we see. Well, if the network you see is like this one that we just looked at, it's pretty obvious where the groups are, right? I can pick the groups out by eye in this network. So fine, I don't need to do anything fancy here. But if the network is like this one, then it's a little bit harder to tell. Are there groups in this network? Well, maybe. It looks like maybe there's sort of something over here on the right and something over here on the left, but it's really not entirely clear. And this network only has about 100 nodes in it. There's actually networks that have billions of nodes in. So it becomes very hard to pick out the groups. Actually, this network has very strong groups in it. I'll tell you what this network is for football fans. This is the network of Division 1A college football teams in the NCAA. So it includes the University of Michigan in there somewhere. And the edges are who played a game against whom in the last season. Okay? So there is a very strong community structure in this network due to what? The conference. Somebody said it. Yeah, the conferences, right? So the Big Ten is a very strong group that you can easily see in this network. Right? So there's very strong community structure in here, but you'd be hard-pressed to tell that by looking at this network. Right? It's not obvious from the picture. And when the picture gets much bigger, it becomes exceedingly non-obvious. So we want a way of finding these groups in networks. Well, it turns out that there is a good way of doing that using exactly the idea we just talked about, this modularity idea. What is this modularity? This modularity is something that tells you when you've got a good division into groups, right? It tells you, if I'm looking at how people divide along lines of age, it tells me whether that division is really good. Most of the friendships are within the groups. Most of the friendships are between people who are the same age, and only a few of them are between people of different age. That's exactly the homophily thing that we were just talking about, right? And that modularity measure that we defined is exactly a measure of that. It gives you a big number if you have a good division, if most of the friendships are within groups and only a few of them are between groups. So here's the way we do it. We say, here's a possible division of this network into groups. I'm going to come up with some division, and then I'm going to calculate the modularity. Right? I'm going to see if that's a big number. If it is a big number, then that was a good division. Right? So the way we do this in practice is we just look through every possible way of dividing up the network, and we find the one that has the biggest value of the modularity, and that's the best possible division into networks. So we came up with a computer algorithm that can do this. You feed a network into the computer, and it comes up with the best possible way of dividing this network up into groups. So here's a couple of examples from our work. I'll finish with these. So this is a social network example. It's a network of students in a university. This is actually a famous network from the social networks literature. This is it shows a network of students in a club at a university. It's a karate club, a place that students go to practice their karate. So a student organization. And it's from a study done in the 1970s. A guy called Wayne Zachary spent a while observing this particular group of students. He was just sort of interested in the social interactions between them. And he made this sort of social network of who's friends with whom in this club. Why is this an interesting example? Well, because it turned out that something funny happened. While he was studying them, there was a dispute within the club. It was about whether to raise the fees for the club. And as a result of this dispute, the club ended up breaking into two parts, and half of the people went off to start their own separate club. Right? So it's split in two. Here is the network of who's friends with whom measured before the split happened. And we take that and we feed it into our computer program, and it says best split of the network is that one there along the dotted line. It says you should divide it up there. The circles and the squares represent how it actually split in real life. And it's perfect. It agrees exactly, right? So we've taken something that was measured before the split happened, and we did some calculation on it, and it predicted how the network was going to split up, even though the measurements were made before the split actually happened. Here's another example. This example comes from some work that I did with a marine biologist called David Lusso, who's at Aberdeen University in the UK. David studies, amongst other things, dolphins. So this is an animal social network. Some animals have social networks, and dolphins apparently do. They're very sociable animals. Apparently dolphins make friendships with other dolphins, and if you're a dolphin expert, like David is, then you can tell which dolphins are friends with which other ones just by observation. They tend to hang out together a lot. So David spent a long time bobbing around on boats in Doubtful Sound, New Zealand, watching dolphins. This is one of the groups of dolphins that he watched. There are 62 dolphins in this group, and this is, again, is a network that he constructed of which dolphins were friends with which other dolphins. And again, an interesting thing happened in this example. While he was doing this study, one dolphin disappeared. It's that one marked by the triangle there in the middle. We don't know where it went, but it wasn't dead because it came back again about 2 years later. So it just went dolphin walkabout for a couple of years. And so the interesting thing was when that dolphin disappeared, the dolphin community split into two. Right? Half of the dolphins went off and did their own thing. They stopped hanging out together. Right? So apparently that one triangle there was the dolphin glue that was holding the whole thing together. And when it went away, it split up into these two groups. So we took this network, again, network measured before the split happened, feed it into our computer program, and it says split it along that dotted line there. The actual split that happened in real life was the circles versus the squares again. So you can see in this case we didn't get it perfectly right. We got a few dolphins wrong, but we did pretty well. Right? We got a pretty good division that predicts how the community was going to split up before it actually happened. So this is kind of the goal of a lot of these things. We would like to come up with methods where we can take a network that we measure and we can just do some simple calculation on that network, and it will tell us something real about the way the system is going to behave in the real world. This is sort of the gold standard. This is the goal that we have for the kind of work that we do. We would certainly like to get more results like this. I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop talking now. I hope that I've persuaded you that there are interesting things to say in this field. I'd be very happy to answer questions if you've got them, but that's it for now. Thanks for coming.